Nobody in that courtroom thought he belonged except the boy himself. The gavel hadn't even struck, but judgment was already passed, not by the law, but by the color of his skin. 12-year-old Elijah Brooks sat alone at the defendant's table, legs barely reaching the floor, eyes steady beneath thick glasses. His hoodie was plain, his jeans frayed, but his presence was oddly composed. He didn't fidget like most kids his age. He didn't even flinch when the bailiff called out his name, like it was a crime in itself. Across the room, Judge Harold Whitmore adjusted his robe with a huff. The courtroom lights cast shadows over his pale, wrinkled face. He peered down through wire-rimmed glasses at the docket before scoffing aloud. "This is a criminal arraignment, not a parent-teacher conference," he muttered, loud enough for the entire room to hear. A chuckle rippled from the gallery. Elijah didn't blink. Whitmore leaned forward. "Where are this boy's parents?" A public defender, Harvey Langston, overworked and indifferent, stood halfway up from his bench. "Your Honor, the minor insists on representing himself. Says he doesn't trust our office." The judge arched a brow. "Of course he doesn't." Another soft wave of laughter. "Son," Whitmore continued, voice thick with condescension, "this isn't a school debate team. You're being charged with obstruction, property damage, and resisting arrest. I suggest you let the adults do their jobs." Elijah stood. The courtroom fell silent. "I've read the case file, Your Honor. I understand the charges and the relevant statutes. I'll be representing myself pursuant to Rule 3.111(d)(3), Florida versus Doe, and Florida versus California. If that's a problem, we can argue about competency." There was no cockiness in his tone, just quiet certainty. Almost eerie. Judge Whitmore blinked. The courtroom didn't know whether to laugh again or hold its breath. "Sit down," the judge ordered, clearly rattled. "We'll see how long your little act lasts." But it wasn't an act. From the first witness to the last, Elijah cross-examined with surgical precision. He questioned Officer Daniels on the legality of his search, pulling out inconsistencies between the written report and body cam footage he himself had subpoenaed through a written motion days earlier. He challenged chain of custody documentation like he'd done it 100 times. When the prosecution attempted to object, he calmly cited precedent, forcing even the prosecutor to flip through her notes. People began to murmur. Reporters whispered into their phones, and the judge's smug mask cracked. By the time the lunch recess was called, half the courtroom wasn't sure who they were rooting for anymore. "You went to law school, kid?" a court officer asked him outside the chambers. Elijah didn't answer. He just looked at the man and said, "I read." But behind the boy's composure was a backstory no one cared to ask about yet. Elijah grew up in South Side Chicago, in a rundown apartment where the walls knew more arguments than laughter. His mother, a nurse, worked night shifts. His father had vanished after a traffic stop turned violent 5 years earlier. Since then, Elijah had turned silence into study and rage into resolve. At 9, he found a tattered copy of To Kill a Mockingbird in a thrift shop bin. By 10, he was reading Gideon's Trumpet, The New Jim Crow, and every Supreme Court transcript he could find online. The law became both shield and sword, and Elijah vowed to master the language of the system that stole his father. But no amount of study prepared him for the weight of walking into a courtroom where people laughed before he spoke. Back in session, Elijah called his final witness, Ms. Lorraine Beecham, a middle-aged woman with a walker who lived across the street from the alley where he was arrested. She testified that she saw the police tackle Elijah after he shouted at them to stop harassing a homeless man. "Elijah, did I touch the officers, ma'am?" "Lorraine, no, baby. You didn't lay a finger on them. You just screamed. Loud. Real loud." Prosecutor, objection irrelevant. Elijah, goes to the nature of the alleged obstruction, Your Honor. Judge Whitmore, now visibly sweating, sustained. "But proceed." Elijah turned to the jury. "The prosecution wants you to believe I'm dangerous because I raised my voice. I didn't resist arrest, I resisted silence. I resisted watching another black man get beaten for existing." No one laughed now. The judge shifted in his chair, his gavel untouched. That night, Elijah went viral. A reporter from the Tribune had tweeted a clip from the courtroom. 12-year-old black boy schools, judge in Chicago. Within hours, it was national. Civil rights attorneys called. Ivy League professors wrote think pieces. But none of them had been there when Elijah walked home, hoodie up, past the same squad cars that once shoved his face into the concrete. The verdict didn't come that day. It was a bench trial, meaning Judge Whitmore would rule. But as Elijah packed his notes, the judge cleared his throat. "Son," he said, voice tinged with something unfamiliar, maybe guilt, maybe fear. "Where did you learn all this?" Elijah met his eyes. "From watching people like you." Then he walked out. That night, Judge Harold Whitmore sat alone in his chambers, staring at Elijah's handwritten motion to dismiss. In perfect grammar, it cited 5 separate constitutional violations and named officers by badge number. His hand trembled. He hadn't seen it coming. He never did. The second day of trial began with heavier eyes and quieter mouths. The courtroom was packed, but the energy had shifted. Gone were the snickers. In their place, whispers, cautious respect, and curiosity. People didn't come to see a novelty anymore. They came to witness something none of them could name, but all of them could feel. Elijah entered in the same hoodie and jeans, his notes neatly folded in a weathered manila folder. He took his place again at the defense table. No one tried to stop him this time, not even the judge. Judge Whitmore gavelled the room to order, though his voice lacked its usual thunder. "We'll proceed with closing arguments." Prosecution. Assistant State Attorney Miriam Kleinrose. She was in her late 30s, sharp, articulate, and not particularly fond of losing. But even she had to recalibrate her tone. Gone was the casual dismissal in her voice from the day before. "Your Honor, this case isn't about how smart the defendant is. It's about facts. And the facts are clear. Elijah Brooks inserted himself into an active police encounter, refused lawful orders, and created a scene that endangered public safety. It doesn't matter how eloquent his objections were. What matters is that the law was broken." She paused. "If we allow people, children, evento dictate police behavior from the sidewalk, we invite chaos." Then she sat. Whitmore turned to Elijah. Defense. Elijah stood slowly. This time, there was no need to prove he belonged. His presence already echoed through the room. He walked in front of the jury box, notes untouched. He didn't need them. "When I was 10, he began, I watched a man die." A hush swept the room. "My dad was pulled over by police a few blocks from our house. The tail light was broken. He asked them why they were searching his car. They told him to step out. He didn't argue. He just asked, 'What did I do?' They pushed him, slammed him to the ground, said he was resisting. I saw it from the sidewalk. I screamed. I wanted to run to him, but my mom held me back, told me not to say anything or we'd both end up like him." He looked down for a moment, breathed. "I remember thinking I wish I knew the right words. Maybe if I knew the law, they would have listened. Maybe he wouldn't have died with his face in the gravel." He looked up again, gaze steady. "So I learned the words. I learned all the words. And now, 2 years later, I see another black man being yelled at by police. Same tone, same stance, same fear in his eyes. And I screamed again. This time I screamed with the words I'd been saving." Elijah turned to the judge. "They say I caused chaos. I say I caused a pause. That man walked away that day. He's alive. Maybe because I yelled loud enough to make them hesitate. He turned to the gallery now. I'm 12. I'm not a threat. I don't have a badge or a weapon. All I have is my voice. And if that scares people, maybe they should ask themselves why. Silence. Heavy and trembling. Even Judge Whitmore looked down. The trial adjourned for the judge to deliberate. Elijah waited outside, sitting alone on the courthouse steps, knees tucked to his chest. Reporters tried to get close, but a look from Elijah's mother, who had finally arrived after taking emergency leave, sent them scattering. I didn't know you were going to do all this, she said softly, sitting beside him. I had to, Elijah replied. I couldn't let them lie about what happened. His mother nodded. You sounded like your father in there. That made Elijah flinch, not from pain, but from a memory sharp as glass. He would have been proud, she added. They waited together. 37 minutes later, the verdict came in. The courtroom filled again. Judge Whitmore entered, robe hanging heavier than usual. He didn't look at Elijah as he spoke. The court finds the defendant not guilty on all charges. Gasps. Whispers. One woman clapped before being shushed. Elijah's mother grabbed his hand. Her grip trembled. But Whitmore wasn't finished. This court also acknowledges that the defendant demonstrated extraordinary understanding of legal procedure and constitutional law. While the actions of law enforcement will be referred to internal review, this ruling is not a condemnation of the Chicago Police Department. However, it is a reminder that the law applies to all parties, regardless of badge or age. Then, finally, he looked at Elijah. Mr. Brooks, you challenged my expectations. I won't forget that. Neither would the city. By that evening, Elijah's face was on every local news broadcast. CNN called. So did 60 Minutes. His mother declined them all. Elijah is not a symbol, she said. He's a boy. Let him breathe. But the story couldn't be boxed away. Civil rights groups asked to sponsor his education. Harvard Law sent him a letter. The ACLU offered an internship for when he turned 16. Donations poured into a scholarship fund started by a stranger who had only seen the courtroom footage once and wept. But not everyone was applauding. Online, conspiracy theories swirled. No way a 12-year-old could do that. He was coached. A stunt by liberal media. Anonymous trolls spammed the family's address. Police unions issued carefully worded statements about respecting the court's decision. Meanwhile, Elijah stayed quiet. He didn't go viral again. He didn't do interviews. He spent most days back at his school library, reading the Constitution one amendment at a time. Until one afternoon, a letter arrived. Thick envelope, cream-colored seal. From Washington, D.C. It was from the U.S. Department of Justice. Inside, an invitation to speak at a youth justice symposium. Elijah showed the letter to his mom. She hesitated. You sure you want this? Elijah looked out the window, where kids his age were playing ball, unaware of case law and courtroom politics. I don't want it, he said, but I think I need it. His mother sighed. Then we'll buy you a suit. He didn't smile. Not quite, but there was a flicker of something close. The night before the symposium, Elijah practiced his speech in the mirror. The theme was justice for all. He had written 3 versions, but scrapped them all. Finally, he spoke from memory. My name is Elijah Brooks. I'm 12 years old. I don't come from Courtroom. I come from a street corner, a school lunch line, a library without enough books. I don't wear a badge. I don't have power, but I understand pain. And pain taught me that silence helps no one. He paused. They laughed at me when I stood in that courtroom. And they were right, too. I looked like a joke until I spoke. Until I used the law that was supposed to protect me, even though it never really had. He stared at himself in the mirror. The law is supposed to be blind, but sometimes it just chooses not to look. The reflection stared back. Not a child, not a hero, something in between. Elijah turned off the light. The next morning, he would take the stage before federal judges, attorneys, and students. But for now, He closed his folder and whispered to no one. I'm not done. The auditorium was massive, more like a concert hall than a place for policy discussions. Rich mahogany walls, velvet-lined chairs, an elevated stage with a podium so polished it gleamed. Elijah had never been in a space like this, and yet, as he stood backstage gripping his speech, he didn't feel small. He felt ready. From the wings, a staffer whispered, "You're up in 2." He nodded. Through the curtain, he heard the moderator announce him. And now, we're honored to welcome a young man whose courtroom courage captured the nation's attention. Please join me in welcoming Elijah Brooks. The applause wasn't thunder, it was respectful, thoughtful. A curious silence followed as Elijah walked out, his frame tiny against the tall podium, but his steps steady. He reached the microphone and adjusted it without asking for help. Then he looked out at the sea of suits and eyes, many belonging to people decades older than him, most of them white. My name is Elijah Brooks, he began, voice calm. I'm 12 years old, and 2 months ago, I stood trial for a crime I didn't commit. The room leaned in. I didn't break the law. I challenged it. I questioned how it was being used. And because I questioned loudly, because I was a black boy yelling at white officers, I was arrested. No hesitation. No stammer. I stood in court without a lawyer because I couldn't trust the ones who didn't see me as human first. I cited precedent because my father couldn't. Because when he was stopped 5 years ago, he didn't know the right words, and now he's gone. There was a shift in the air, not just pity awareness. I didn't come here to impress you. I came here to say the system you run doesn't protect kids like me. It's not broken, it's working exactly as it was designed. And unless we redesign it, no speech I give will matter. No court win will be enough. A pause. You call me a prodigy, a genius, a miracle. But I'm not a miracle, I am a warning. I shouldn't have had to become an expert at 12 just to survive. He stepped back from the podium. That was it. No dramatic mic drop. No bow. But the silence that followed was longer than any standing ovation. And then they stood, one by one, row by row, judges, law professors, students, activists, even DOJ officials. Not because they agreed with everything he said, but because they couldn't deny he'd said it with more clarity and courage than most adults ever had. Afterward, a stream of people lined up to speak with him. A woman with silver hair and Supreme Court clerk credentials shook his hand and whispered, "You made me rethink everything." A black judge from New Jersey hugged his mother. He reminded me why I joined the bench. A nervous teenage girl pushed through the crowd and handed Elijah a folded note. He pocketed it without opening it, unsure of what to say. All this attention, it felt like both a spotlight and a microscope. That night, he and his mother flew back to Chicago. She let him take the window seat. He pressed his forehead to the glass, watching clouds drift below like slow-moving thoughts. Back home, things were different. His school, where teachers once marked him as disruptive or too argumentative, now praised his gifted thinking. They invited him to speak at assemblies, featured him in newsletters, and began a Brooks Scholars reading group. But not all the change was welcome. Some students who used to ignore him now followed him in the halls like he was a celebrity. Others, mostly older, white, boys mocked him with fake lawyer accents or whispered objection when he walked past. One day, someone spray-painted the word liar on his locker. He didn't report it. He just kept walking. But at night, he began sleeping with the light on again. Despite the media narrative, Elijah was not okay. Fame had given him a platform, but it had also stripped away his anonymity, his peace, his ability to just be a kid. He had been transformed from a human into a headline, and it was suffocating. He stopped going to interviews, turned down speaking events, declined a scholarship to a prestigious prep school that wanted to nurture his unique potential. He just wanted to go home and read. Then, 3 weeks after his DOJ speech, something unexpected happened. Judge Harold Whitmore called. Not his office him. Directly. His mother answered first. Why would a judge be calling my son? Elijah took the phone, curious and cautious. Mr. Brooks, Whitmore said, his voice tighter than it had been in court. I owe you something. Elijah said nothing. I have requested that you be granted observer access to the juvenile court program at Cook County. No cameras, no press, just you, me, and the courtroom. Why? Because I've been watching a system for 40 years, and you made me see it differently. I'm not saying you're right about everything, but I'm saying you should see more. Not just your own case. Other kids. Other stories. Elijah agreed. He started shadowing Whitmore once a week. What he saw changed him. Kids in orange jumpsuits, shackled for stealing headphones. A 13-year-old sentenced to a year of probation for skipping school. A girl his age who cried when the judge mispronounced her name and didn't correct him. Elijah sat through every session, scribbling notes furiously, asking questions afterward that Whitmore didn't always have answers to. Why is the public defender juggling 9 cases at once? Why is bail set higher for kids from Englewood than from Oak Park? Why do we call it juvenile justice if it treats kids like criminals? One day, Whitmore sighed, because the law bends slowly, and sometimes it snaps. Elijah looked him in the eye. Then we need more pressure. After months of observing, Elijah decided to do something. Not a protest, not a speech, a bill. He called it the Youth Equal Protection Draft. It proposed restrictions on juvenile detention for nonviolent offenders, mandatory racial bias training for judges and prosecutors, and funding for legal literacy programs in underfunded schools. He brought it to a local civil rights firm. They didn't laugh. They edited it. They showed it to a state rep, and the rep showed it to the floor. It didn't pass yet, but it was heard, and that, Elijah knew, was more than most 12-year-olds ever got. By spring, Elijah was back in court, but this time, seated beside Whitmore, not across from him. And when a public defender fumbled a basic procedural motion, Elijah scribbled a correction on his notepad and slid it quietly across the bench. Whitmore glanced at it. He used it. He ruled accordingly. Later, he said, you've probably saved more kids from lockup than I have in 10 years. Elijah didn't smile. He just whispered, I know. But deep inside, something softened. Just a little. He was still a boy who couldn't bring his father back. Still a boy who slept with the light on, who flinched when squad cars drove too slowly past his building. But he was also something else now. He was a voice the system couldn't yet. A name the court couldn't ignore. A mirror held up to a country that had never truly seen children like him. And he was only getting started. Months turned into a year. Elijah turned 13 quietly, without a party. His mother offered to host something small, just family and neighbors. He refused politely. There's still work to do, he said. That was how he marked time, now not in birthdays, but in case briefs, legislation drafts, court observations, and hours spent reading thick law books most adults found unbearable. He'd become a quiet legend in legal circles, though many still dismissed him as a fluke. A smart kid who had gotten lucky. A courtroom anomaly. A novelty. But in the neighborhoods that mattered in Englewood, in Garfield Park, in West Pool, Maine, was something more. A symbol. Kids who'd once feared speaking in class now asked about the Constitution. Teens who thought jail was inevitable asked Elijah how to write a motion. He even started a weekend program at a local library, Know Your Rights 101, with help from a few public defenders who'd once underestimated him. It filled up every Saturday. But still, Elijah wrestled with a burden that no 13-year-old should carry. The haunting awareness that no matter how brilliant he was, the wrong encounter with the wrong officer on the wrong day could end everything. Then came the case that tested him more than any trial. A 15-year-old boy named Malik Jefferson Hall, dark-skinned, quiet, was arrested after a white store owner accused him of stealing a cell phone. There was no video, no witnesses, just suspicion and fear. The cops detained him, and when he tried to ask what he was being charged with, one of them claimed he resisted. They fractured his wrist. Elijah saw the photos. Malik's wrist swollen, his eyes bruised, the scrawled police report full of vague language and no real detail. Worse, Malik was being tried as an adult. It was Elijah's neighborhood, his library, his community, and he knew, this could have been me. Malik's mother reached out to Elijah's mother in desperation. I heard your son knows the law. Can he help us? Elijah didn't hesitate. I'll prepare the case. You're 13, his mother whispered when they were alone. This is bigger than a classroom debate. The state's going to fight dirty. They want to make an example out of Malik. Elijah's eyes didn't waver. Then we fight smarter. He couldn't represent Malik formally. He wasn't licensed. But he could prepare the entire defense, line by line. He could draft arguments, anticipate objections, and coach the public defender assigned to the case. Mr. Langston, the same one who had once dismissed Elijah in his own trial. This time, Langston listened. Elijah spent nights at the library and weekends in conference rooms. He reconstructed the police timeline, pulled GPS logs from cell towers, and uncovered that the store owner had a previous record of filing false police reports, something the prosecution had conveniently omitted. He helped write a motion to suppress all statements made by Malik during custody, citing the lack of a guardian or attorney present, violations of Enrigault and Miranda versus Arizona. When Langston presented the motion in court, it was met with silence. Judge Whitmore was presiding. He scanned the document. Then he looked up at Langston and said, "You didn't write this, did you?" Langston hesitated. "No, Your Honor. I had assistants." Whitmore didn't ask who, but his eyes flicked toward Elijah, seated quietly behind the defense bench, notepad in hand. 3 days later, the motion was granted. The prosecution's case collapsed. Malik walked free. Outside the courthouse, his mother sobbed into Elijah's shoulder. "You saved my boy." But Elijah didn't cry. He just stood still, as if waiting for someone to tap him on the shoulder and say, "That's enough. Go back to being a child." No one did. That night, Judge Whitmore requested a meeting. It was just the two of them, seated in his chambers. "I saw what you did for Malik," Whitmore said. "You gave him back his life, and you did it without a single headline." "I didn't want another viral video," Elijah replied. "I wanted justice." Whitmore nodded. "I used to believe the law was a straight road. You follow it, you end up somewhere fair. But now I know it's crooked, and people like you straighten it." He reached into his drawer and pulled out a slim box. Inside was a pen. "Elijah, this was my father's. He passed it to me when I passed the bar. I want you to have it." Elijah blinked. "But I'm not a lawyer." "Not yet," Whitmore said. "But you're already something more rare of force." He paused. "Use it to sign the future." Elijah didn't answer. He couldn't. His throat locked up with emotion he hadn't allowed himself to feel in months. That night, he returned home and stared at the pen on his desk. Then he did something he hadn't done in a long time. He wrote a letter. Not a motion, not a speech. A letter to his father. "Dear Dad, I don't know if you'd recognize me now. I don't even know if I'd recognize you if you walked through the door. But I think about you every time I enter a courtroom. I think about how different life might have been if someone had stood between you and that badge. I couldn't save you, but maybe I saved someone else's dad. Maybe I stopped a tragedy before it started. They say I'm special, a prodigy, a genius. But mostly I just feel tired. Still, I keep going. Not because I want to be famous, but because I want to make you proud. I want to make the law proud. I want to make myself proud. You told me once that the world doesn't give black boys many chances. but I'm going to take mine and turn it into a door for others. Love, Elijah. He folded it, placed it in a drawer, and turned off the light. From that point on, Elijah moved deliberately. At 14, he testified before the Illinois state legislature about youth incarceration. At 15, he launched a nonprofit called the Brooks Defense Project, offering legal literacy workshops in underserved schools. At 16, he passed the LSAT. And at 17, Harvard Law welcomed him as its youngest student in history. They gave him a full scholarship. His first day on campus, a professor asked, "What made you want to become a lawyer?" Elijah looked out the window, where Boston's old brick buildings stood proud and silent. Then he answered, "I don't want to become a lawyer. I want to become a system that doesn't need one." The classroom fell silent, and Elijah smiled for the first time in a long, long time, because now he wasn't just fighting the system. He was building a new one where no black boy had to memorize legal codes just to feel safe. One where a hoodie in a courtroom didn't mean ridicule, but resilience. One where the law was no longer a weapon but a promise. And this time, Elijah wasn't the only one carrying it. The generation behind him was rising, reading, resisting, rewriting, and somewhere in the soft rhythm of Chicago's streets, where injustice once roared, a new sound echoed. The sound of justice learning to listen. The sound of a boy becoming a movement. And it all began with a courtroom that tried to laugh at him, and a boy who chose to answer with truth. Thank you for listening. If you find it interesting, please like and subscribe to follow the next stories.